Namaskar, everyone. Today's memorial lecture is a humble attempt on the part of the IS University, especially the Department of English, to pay tribute to the memory of a person who had worked relentlessly towards and achieved much in realizing the goals of education, Professor N.K. Jain. With education moving into new terrains, we hope to make a conscious effort to carry forward the ideals and values that he lived by. We strongly believe that as an institution, we can draw inspiration and guidance from the rich legacy that he has left behind. We are both delighted and honored to have Professor Subramanian Shankar in our midst, who has so very graciously acceded to our request to deliver the fourth Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture. Thank you, sir, and welcome. I also welcome late Professor Jain's family, relatives, friends, and colleagues, and acknowledge the presence of his students as well. May I now invite Professor T.N. Mathur, Honorable Vice Chancellor, for his welcome address.
Namaskar. Professor Shankar, invited guest speaker of this memorial lecture, and Jain family, Professor N.K. Jain family, Mrs. and other members of the family, Vice Chancellor, Professor Sudhir Rajiv, and Registrar of the University, Professor Aki Gupta, and organizer of this event, Professor Ramika Singhvi, and other colleagues and my senior colleagues of my parent university, Professor Sudha Rai, Professor K.K. Gautam, Professor Santosh Gupta, and other colleagues. A warm welcome to you all on the occasion of the fourth Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture being organized by IIS deemed to be University, Jaipur. We are a cosmopolitan and vibrant institution, having moved into the third decade of nationwide presence as a leading institution of higher education, grooming the next generation of world-ready creative leadership. Today is the time of the year again when we come together for this memorial lecture, organized to celebrate the life and times of Professor N.K. Jain and find our way back to the benchmark set by an academician who remains to all those who knew him a fine embodiment of a life well lived. To look back to the days when Professor Jain came to be associated with our university is to remember someone who was driven to excel, to nurture, to guide. As Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, he fulfilled those roles to the best of his prodigium abilities. A scholar at heart and teacher by vocation, he led by his own example, showing students and faculty members alike what teaching and learning truly meant. Coming from a strong academic and professional background, he touched many minds with the vast knowledge, exceptional grasp of language and literature, a unique wit of and turn expression, and a rare sense of humor, which his students and colleagues remember to this day. His stepping into a classroom was met with a sense of excitement and expectation. His students, knowing that they would leave enriched and improved in equal measure. Leading his audience in open discourse, he ably encouraged suggestions and innovation with regard to both teaching and research. His journey inspired all who knew him. He enriched by those who hold fond memories of the person he was. Well liked and deeply respected by friends, relatives, and colleagues. Professor Jain is thus remembered as a steadfast pillar of this IAS family. Over the years, the erudite scholarship laid down the groundwork for the friendships and academic connections that have sustained till date. Many of those people, I am sure, are in the audience today. I am happy to welcome you all to the fourth Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture, which has been organized at the initiative of the University Department of English. Professor Jain's parent department to honor the memory of dear colleague and revered teacher. I extend a special welcome to Mrs. Mithilesh Jain, Professor Jain's wife, and most importantly, Professor Subramanian Shankar, who I cannot thank enough for his gracious consent to deliver this fourth commemorative lecture. Thank you all. Welcome.
Thanks a lot, sir. May I now invite Professor Ella Joshi, Dean, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, to formally introduce the eminent speaker for the day, Professor Shankar, before inviting him to deliver the memorial lecture.
Thank you, Rimika. Namaskar, everyone. It's a matter of immense pride for me to formally introduce the distinguished speaker, the very eminent Professor S. Shankar, to the audience. Dr. S. Shankar is a novelist, literary and cultural critic, and translator. He is professor and chair in the Department of English at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and a member of the board of external experts appointed to advise the Swedish Academy in the awarding of the Nobel Prize for Literature for a period of 3 years, starting from 2022 to 2025. Dr. Shankar's most recent book is his third novel entitled Ghost in the Tamarind, published in September 2017, which is set against the background of the anti-caste movement in South India during the 20th century. His most recent critical book is the award-winning Flesh and Fish Blood, Post-Colonialism, Translation and Vernacular, published in 2012. He is the co-editor of the collection of scholarly essays, Caste and Life Narratives, which came out in 2017. Dr. Shankar is also the translator of Komal Swaminathan's Tamil play entitled Tanneer, translated as Water. His scholarly essays and cultural journalism have appeared in publications in the US, India, and Europe. His most recent publications include the critical essay, The Ruse of Freedom, a comparative essay on ahimsa and freedom of expression in cultural critique, and the short story, A Servant of the Whole World, forthcoming in Copper Nickel. Dr. S. Shankar is a recipient of a senior Fulbright Nehru Fellowship for 2017-2018. Additionally, he is the recipient of both the University of Hawaii's College of Languages, Linguistics and Literatures Excellence in Teaching and Excellence in Research Awards, and has been honored with Scholar in Residence appointments at SOAS University, London, UK, English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad, India, and the University of Houston in Texas, USA. Dr. S. Shankar blogs at sshankar.net and is currently at work on a critical volume on representations of the poor in novels and films from the United States, Africa, and India. It is with great pleasure that I now invite Professor S. Shankar to deliver the fourth prof.N.K.Jain Memorial Lecture entitled The World is Translation, Reflections on the Practice and Philosophy of Translation. I welcome you, sir.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Professor Joshi, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Dr. Mathur, for your words about the memorial lecture. And I want to acknowledge the family, Professor Jain's family, for helping make this lecture. As a chair of a department, I know how important it is to have support from well-wishers of literary and of literature and the arts. And so I applaud the family for coming forward and supporting this. Professor Jain seems to have been a pretty amazing person who's left a legacy behind at the institution. And that's something which I'm glad that the institution is acknowledging. And I also want to thank Rimika for reaching out with the invitation and for being the guiding spirit behind making all of this happen. So thank you, Rimika, for the invitation. And I'm very pleased to be here delivering this lecture on the heels of the many eminent people, the three other eminent people, the three eminent people. I'm not sure I'm an eminent person, so I shouldn't say three other eminent people. I should say the three eminent people have gone before me and given, I'm sure, pretty wonderful lectures. Both Radha and Arjun are friends. I know they work very well, so I'm pleased to come after them and deliver this lecture. So what I'm going to do today, and everybody can hear me properly, no problems. Yeah, everything's coming through well. Just making sure before I keep going. If somebody, Remika, could just confirm
Yes,
that
sir,
I'm
all good. I think
all
all
good.
good. I'm
Okay, very good.
speaking
I
on
might
behalf of the participants. Yeah.
I might
Thanks.
stop and do that a couple of times because I just
Sure, sir.
like to make sure that I'm not speaking into the void, the
No,
virtual
we're
void.
right here.
And so, okay, so
No.
what I'm going to do is the title of the presentation is The World is Translation, reflections on the practices and philosophy of translation. And so what I want to do is really speak for maybe about 40 minutes on a few important topics to do with translation, something which I've wrestled with for more than 20 years. So I want to make maybe three different areas of comment about translation in relationship to world, translation in relationship to practice, and then translation in relationship to philosophy or theory, kind of a field which is maybe more specifically within the realm of literature and culture, but is very allied to philosophy, but isn't quite philosophy, right? So those are broadly the three areas within which I want to talk about translation, but I want to do it in such a way that it's not extremely abstract, and I want to mention things without necessarily going very deep into all the nuances of it, because what I really want to do is to generate a conversation that we might have, all of us together, about the place and the function of translation within the world. Yeah, so that's my purpose here. So I plan to speak for maybe 40 minutes, 35 to 40 minutes, and then I'll stop, and then hopefully we can have a robust conversation. So translation, relationship with the world. The first thing, which there's some construction and things going on around here, so bear with me if there's some background noise. Yeah. So the relationship between translation and the world, we often tend to think of translation very narrowly, right? So translation, especially within the academy, we tend to think of translation as what happens, when somebody translates a book of poems from one language into the other, and we think of translation in this very narrow sense. But translation, of course, in the way in which I want to talk about it today, and in the way in which it becomes a really interesting topic, that is an interesting topic too, but it becomes even more interesting when we realize that translation is everywhere. It's not just taking a text in one language and putting it in another language, but the relationship between translation and the world is much more complex, and one might even say that it is absolutely central to even any conception of the world, which is why my title is The World is Translation. It's not that translation is one part of the world, but the world is translation, and why one might think that, and what are the consequences of thinking about the world in that way, is some of what I want to talk about. Yeah. So, but then of course there is actually the practice of translation as well, right? The world is translation, very large, very ambitious, very huge claim, and maybe I will talk about a couple of things about that. But then there is also, to go to the other end of the spectrum, translation is also a practice, right? So there have been very interesting commentary about many translators about what happens when they actually sit down and translate, right? And that's a very fascinating subject in itself. There are, of course, workshops, courses in literary translation. Another kind of practice of translation, which is separate from literary translation, but also very technical, also taught in a kind of a very practical, pragmatic way. Interpretation, right? What we call interpretation. What happens in the United Nations General Assembly when the world leader is speaking, and then you see all the members of the General Assembly. I don't know if you have seen pictures of I'm going to the most sort of iconic maybe scene of that kind of interpretation where there are all these invited members of the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York sitting in the Assembly Hall, and then somebody is speaking, maybe Narendra Modi is speaking in Hindi, or the Premier of Japan is speaking Japanese, and everybody's wearing speakers, and there's of course live interpretation going on, right? From essentially these cabins which are above the assembly, and so there are live interpretation going on. That also is translation. It's a different kind of a translation. Its rhythms are different, its temporalities are different. Obviously translating in real time what somebody is saying is a very different skill than sitting with the poems of Baudelaire and translating it into German, as Walter Benjamin, one of the people that I'll be speaking about, the German philosopher and theorist, Walter Benjamin, very famously discussed, right? So very different practices of translation. And then there is the philosophy of translation, right? This philosophical kind of engagement with translation as a topic. And translation as a philosophical topic has been engaged through the millennia, right? It's not something recent, it goes back centuries, right? There has been more recently, in the last 100 or 120 years, I would say, a modern kind of production of knowledge about translation, right? And translation studies is a field unto itself today, right? And it goes again from practice to philosophy, right? And as a field, translation studies from a variety of different perspectives. So that's great diversity and maybe even dissent within the field in terms of how to think about translation. But translation studies is a field within which translation is studied, right? Explored, different dimensions of it discussed. And just as there are different fields of study, translation is a field of study within itself. And I would say that most of the important philosophers of language during the 20th century have had something to say about translation. And that shouldn't surprise us, because once you take on board language as a philosophical problem, I think you are led often to consider translation. What happens between languages, right? Not just language with a capital L as something which is intrinsic to us as human beings, but when you pay attention as a philosopher of language to the diversity of languages, that there are many different languages, really tens of thousands of languages around the world. Why are there tens of thousands of languages? What happens when these different languages interact with each other? How does meaning emerge in a particular language? How is it then taken to another language? So translation is central to these questions about language. And many philosophers of language have had interesting things to say about it. And I'm hoping, time permitting, to kind of maybe touch on one of them. Jacques Derrida, perhaps one of the most important sort of philosophers of language of the last 50 years, of course, wrote about translation in more than one essay. And in a way, I think, which maybe he himself came to realize later in his career, I think most of his theorizing about language was in some sense engaged with translation. So maybe we can think about that as well in the course of thinking about translation in relationship to world and practice and philosophy. So these three sort of terms that I want you to keep in mind as I go forward and make my comments. Before I sort of dive into what I have to say, just kind of make a few brief comments about these three areas, I should share a little bit about my own sort of relationship to translation, Professor Joshi, in her introduction, mentioned that I've actually translated from. I'm a practicing translator. My most significant project of translation was translating the play Tani Tani, Komal Swaminathan's iconic play Tani Tani into English. I don't know how familiar you are with this audience is with Tamil literature, but Komal Swaminathan was, and especially his play Tani Tani, and I think it would be fair to say that no other work of his rises to the level of Tani Tani, but Tani Tani is absolutely central as a to the modern theater tradition in Tamil. You know, he's not probably the most significant. I was having this conversation. I just come to Hyderabad from Chennai, and I was at dinner with some friends who are extremely erudite people and know Tamil literary and cultural scene very well. And so we were having this discussion, and we kind of agreed that maybe Indira Parthasarathy or one of the other sort of dramatists is a more significant figure than Swaminathan in the core, if you looked at the whole history of the 20th century. But I think it would also be fair to say that no other play in Tamil is as significant as Tani Tani, just in terms of its capturing of the popular imagination, its the extent to which it's known, and the sort of ripple of effects that it had. I don't want to get diverted into discussing the play, but I came to translate the play because I was doing this work that was also mentioned in the introduction about representations of the poor. And I was immediately interested in Tani Tani because it is very much, and I was a college student in Chennai when it was first staged and was made into a film by K. Balachandar. So I was very aware and knew about the play. And so I wanted to sort of write about it, and very quickly discovered that no English translation of the play existed. So I started by translating a couple of passages and then ended up translating the whole play, and was very pleased when Siegel in Kolkata published it in their very distinguished series of, translations of plays. And then it's also been staged in Chennai a couple of times in the last 10 years, which was also very gratifying. But all of this is to say that when I come to the question of translation, so I did not really write about translation early in my career. I'm not a comparative literature person. I didn't really study translation as a subject in graduate school when I was getting my PhD. But it is really the act of translating Tani Tani which started me on that trajectory, which brings me to the lecture here, to think about translation in all these different ways. Yeah. Since then, and so I guess what I'm trying to do in this very personal anecdote is to convey a sense of how generative translation can be. Yeah. How generative translation can be once you sort of engage it seriously, the kinds of ways in which it can open up questions for you. It is true that I grew up between languages, and which I think is true of most Indians, I would say. I'm here with visiting family in Hyderabad, and I have my niece has a couple of children who are one is 5 and the other one is 2, and already these children can speak, in a more rudimentary way necessarily, because only 2, they can speak 3 languages. They're speaking English, Hindi, Telugu, Tamil, they have bits of all of that. That is what I mean about growing up. And this is not an unfamiliar story. I'm sure many of you have had the same experience. This is living among languages. This is growing up among languages. And in a monolingual country like the United States, this would be extremely anomalous. When I've lived in the US for more than 35 years, when I share stories like this, it's very foreign to most of my American friends, because, changing now and changing in many parts of the country where you have a lot of Spanish, and there are certainly bilingual and multilingual households, but not as taken for granted as is the case in India or in multilingual nations like India. So here again, I want us to think about translation in the context of this living among languages in the plural, right? So think of translation as something which happens all the time on a daily basis in living in India, and it across class structures, right? I mean, it's not just that you have, the English-speaking elite which experiences this. It may be, Tamil and Kannada in southern Karnataka, but the living among languages is not a class-specific thing, right? It's extremely, diverse. So that is also part of my experience. I grew up in Delhi, I grew up in Mumbai, I grew up in outside India. So really encountered languages in the plural throughout my growing up. And that too is something which, I bring to my reflections on translation. And then I teach a class on a graduate class on translation and comparatism at the University of Hawaii, which I've done for the last 15 years or so. I consider it one of my most important classes. I think it's very popular whenever I teach it. I teach it every 3 years or 4 years. There is an extremely interesting and robust conversation about translation and the politics of language in Hawaii because of the status of Hawaiian as a language. The indigenous people of Hawaii, Hawaiian as their language, which was attempted to be erased maybe about 100 years ago when it was integrated into the United States. When Hawaii was integrated into the United States, there was an English only kind of policy. But of course, Hawaiian survived, and there's been an incredibly rich and powerful revival of Hawaiian since the 1970s. And there are interesting debates about translation within the Hawaiian community, which I'm sort of listening to, and I'm like graduate, I don't know Hawaiian myself, I don't participate in those discussions directly, but a lot of the younger scholars engaging with Hawaiian politics of language have been through my class. And so that's one of the things which is very gratifying to me, to be able to engage with their own sort of struggles. I mean, struggles in a kind of a political sense over language and translation. And I'll give you a very small example. So there's been a kind of, I think it is maybe getting resolved now, but there has been an interesting debate within the Hawaiian community about whether you should or should not translate, right? Hawaiian texts in Hawaiian, which go back from the 19th century and pre-contact in an oral tradition. So there is one group which feels that, yes, you should translate because we need to make these texts more widely available. But, and maybe counterintuitively, there's another group which feels that we should not translate because what we need to do is to make people learn Hawaiian, right? To have people, learn the language and access these texts through learning the language, and in that way make sure that the language itself survives, right? So what exactly is the status of translation here? Is translation a kind of a liberatory move, or is it actually a kind of a non-liberatory move, a move which is going to actually suppress Hawaiian? The answer is not simple, and the answer is something which is still getting, debated. So there are all these different complexities to translation, which I'm trying to give you a sense of. Let me kind of change register a little bit. I've been talking personally and trying to convey to you the complexity of translation. And I have us think about translating the word translation itself, just as a way of kind of bringing us again face to face with the diversity of what is meant by translation. Now, I'm sure most of this audience knows Hindi, maybe everybody does. Now, one of the most common words, of course, which is a translation which is the Hindi word for translation, is anuvad, right? Now, if you think about the etymology of, so when I teach this graduate class to my students, one of the exercises that we do, I typically have anywhere from 10 to 12 languages in that class. I mean, I know 3 pretty well myself, and then there'll be Japanese, there'll be Chinese, there'll be Korean, there'll be Spanish, there will be Hawaiian, So when you put all these languages together, you have people who know anywhere between 10 to 12 different languages. So one of the exercises I have the class do is to actually write a brief essay on the word for translation in their own languages. And very quickly, we begin to realize how complicated our understandings of translation should be, not how complicated they are, because we often have very reductive ideas of translation, but how complicated they should be, right? So in English, translate is derived from Latin, trans, to move, late, which is a kind of a suffix which indicates position. So as you will see, if you read translation theory, this is something which has been glossed quite a bit, that in English, because of this Latin derivation, there is a sense of moving meaning from one place to another. So crossing, carrying over, or bearing across. And Derrida in his essays makes much of this, right? So amongst other things, Derrida was always interested in the etymology of words, sometimes to an excess, in my opinion, but nevertheless, it's one of the ways in which he worked. And so he makes much of this, and he's not the only one to do this. So this recognition that there is something about moving meaning from one place to the other. So one could maybe say something spatial. Now, what I'm driving at, of course, is that anuvad is very different. Anuvad etymologically means to speak after, right? Somebody has spoken and you speak after them, right? So it's temporal because there's a sense of succeeding something which has happened in time. What does that mean? What does it mean to have these different words for translation? Does, within the tradition of Hindi, is translation understood the same way as in English? And one can sort of, once you do this with all the languages you begin to realize how complicated this is. In Tamil, the two words which are most commonly used for translation, both specify Mori or language. So that's a direct acknowledgement, which is not the case in either English or in Hindi, though Hindi does talk about voicing, right? But there's a direct acknowledgement that something is happening with regard to language, right? That's this Mori is part of both these words for translation. So some kind of transference, some kind of transformation is happening to Mori. To language, which is, I suppose, a much more direct understanding of translation. One of the times that I taught my class, I had a student, East African student, who knew Swahili, and so he did this exercise because the whole class is asked to do it, and he mentioned, and this is my knowledge is entirely from him, Sam Opondo, to give him credit. And he wrote this wonderful essay in which the Swahili word, one of the Swahili words, and there might be more than one, is nakal, which again we might recognize in India as nakal karna, to copy, to imitate, right? But it's a word for translation in Swahili, probably through the Arabic, right? So what does it mean to think of copy? What does it mean to speak after? What does it mean to take meaning from one place and to put it elsewhere? What does it mean to think of translation as language transformation? Each one of these terms is very different. And yet we do recognize them as related to each other, as cognate words in different languages for a phenomenon we consider to be the same, which is translation, right? And what I'm asking us to do, two things at the same time, to recognize the commonality among them, that they all refer to the same phenomenon, as well as recognize the non-commonality among them, right? That they are actually have differences, come out of different cultural traditions. In Hawaiian, the term for translation was, I think, invented in the 19th century, and as was explained to me by Brian Kuwata, a wonderful translator and Hawaiian scholar, as meaning to take something out of a bag, right? So I'm not going to try and repeat the word because I don't quite remember it. But essentially, the meaning, the etymology of the word is that there's a bag and then you take something out of it, right? So these are all very different, both, and that's the word for translation. So if you're translating the word translation into Hawaiian, that's the word you would use. And yet its associations, its meanings are at some root level different than what is in English. So I've gone on about this for a bit. I hope everybody is able to kind of get what I'm driving at. That translation is both complicated, that both the commonality and the non-commonality of translation as a phenomenon and as a practice around the world is something that we want to hold on to. So let me sort of again go to very quickly mention two or three sort of the philosophers of language who have offered some very interesting thoughts about translation to us, and I mentioned two of them already, Walter Benjamin and Jacques Derrida. Walter Benjamin, many of you might know, Jewish German philosopher, maybe you could call him, though his work was certainly much more complicated than just philosophy. I think you call him a theorist, call him a cultural critic. He was extremely, what's the right word? Extremely broad in the way in which the topics that he wrote about. Now, he did, as I mentioned very briefly, early in his career, translate the poems of Baudelaire from French into German. And on the occasion of that translation, when the translations were published in German, he wrote this essay, which is absolutely, I think, phenomenal, called The Task of the Translator. And more than the translations, I don't know what's the case in a German-speaking community, but I certainly have never encountered the German translations of Baudelaire that Benjamin made. But I'm very familiar with the essay Task of the Translator. So the preface that he wrote to this collection of translations is more famous than the translations themselves and widely studied. Benjamin, multiple interesting ideas about translation. I want to maybe, focus on one for what it teaches us, because this commonality, non-commonality business, right? So he's struggling with that in his preface. He says, for example, pain and brought, bread in French, bread in German, the two words, one is a translation of the other, and yet they mean these different things. They don't mean quite the same. That's the challenge of the translator. What's common there? How are they different? So he's struggling with this commonality and non-commonality business, which every translator has to struggle with. And then he comes to this, I think, most interesting part of the essay, which is where he talks about pure language, right? He talks about something like pure language, because I think his insight, which is something which not all readers of Benjamin have taken from him, but for me is absolutely crucial, is that you cannot have translation without a third element, right? You cannot have translation from one language into another, one actually existing language like French into another actually existing language like German, without a third element. And that third element is what he calls pure language, right? Now, what is pure language for Benjamin? There are a couple of different ways. He's not entirely clear, though I think there are two conclusions you can draw. One is that pure language is historically something which existed a long time ago, from which all other languages are derived, right? So here you can see, and remember Benjamin is writing in the early 20th century, you can see the echoes of that German-driven scholarship on Indo-European family of languages, right? So Greek, Sanskrit, Latin, all these ancient languages derived from a single language called Indo-European. He doesn't quite say that, though he does make references to that tradition of scholarship. And so I think there is the echo of that historical language called Indo-European, which doesn't exist anymore anywhere, but from which all these languages are derived. And this is contestable, right? I mean, maybe, maybe not, can't really prove it. But more interesting is, I think, his insight that at a structural level, you need something which is the language of languages. And this is what he calls pure language, I think. That the reason why you can go from Pan to Broad, from French to German, is that at a deeper structural level is something where they share some quality of being a pure language, right? They share some quality which is not historical, which doesn't exist actually in the world, but they still share something which makes it possible for us to go from one to the other. This is an extremely challenging philosophical problem. I don't mean to kind of bore us with that more, but I want us to recognize what Benjamin is recognizing, that in going from one language to the other, we need to be able to understand what is common and what is not. Because I think the ethical and the political kind of consequences of this understanding are quite profound, right? Because we can both recognize, it's a way to recognize what brings us all together, that there has to be something that brings us all together, but also to recognize difference, right? So I think what he's really struggling with is a way to make sense of both difference and what unites us. And I think all translators, in some sense, are struggling with that as well. Yeah. I want to speak for just maybe another 5. So I'm looking at my watch because I don't want to take up, I don't want to just keep going on and make sure that we have time for conversation. I can expand on some of these things in the discussion that follows. So I want to make a comment about Derrida, whose work I think, again, many of you might be familiar with. Derrida wrote about translation in at least 3 or 4 essays very directly. And I would say that in other works of his, translation is at issue in a more broad way. And unlike Benjamin, whose work he does comment on in his own writing, I mean, how could he not? I think there are certain sort of continuities of lineage between Benjamin and Derrida, both of whom are European Jewish philosophers with very sort of, I think, maybe, not with complicated relationship to that Jewish heritage, right? It's not as if they're like, I'm a Jewish philosopher and that's how I'm speaking, but you can see echoes of Jewish mysticism in Benjamin's writing, and so too with Derrida, yeah? So of course he's interested in Benjamin, and of course he comments on Benjamin's task as a translator. But Derrida, as we are very familiar, is much more skeptical about languages in general, right? So something like pure language is not so easily available to him, right? So unlike Benjamin, for him, the differences are much more important. And for him, every act of translation, every site of translation, and he often can be seen as so far as saying that every language act is an act of translation, right? Because even within the same language, even as I'm speaking in English to all of you, and all of you are listening to me speak in English, there are miscommunications, there are lack of transference. And this is what, of course, translation highlights for us, right? Translation insists, the idea, the phenomenon of translation insists that we attend to how communication happens between languages. But Derrida is proposing that those kinds of miscommunications and difficulties are present within the same language in extremely radical ways. What I mean by radical is very foundational to language itself. So he's very interested in translation, but I think in a way which is much more skeptical about the ability of translation to deliver on what it promises. I myself am not all the way there with Derrida, But he is raising this issue in an extremely powerful way and asking us to think about the ethical consequences of that. And then there's somebody like Roman Jakobson, again, a very important essay that he wrote in the 1950s, Russian linguist, wrote on a number of different topics, but also interested in translation. And he very famously talked about translation as having these three different dimensions. One he calls interlingual, that is the one that going from French to German. And then he calls a second dimension semiotic, which opens up an entirely new area of study, which is what happens when you go from one science system to another science system. Yeah. So when you take meaning from one science system and put it into another. The most famous example would be, of course, which all of us are familiar with, is adaptations of novels into films. Rag Darbari, iconic Hindi novel made into a television series, I believe in the 80s or the 90s. Semiotic translation, right? You're going from something which is printed and in language, and you're transferring it into an audiovisual medium. So this is what he calls, semiotic translation. But interestingly, he also talks about intralingual translation. So it's kind of touching on something which Derrida, of course, is going to theorize in a much more powerful and elaborate way, which is that elements of translation are present even within the same language, right? Jakobson is not the language skeptic that Derrida is, so he doesn't understand this in quite as thoroughgoing a way as Derrida does, but you see definitely an acknowledgement of this. And a very, I think, simple illustration of this in the Jakobsonian way would be sort of dialect, right? So you have African American uses of language, which may be quite unfamiliar to those who are not African American. That might be the same word, which has a specific meaning within the African American community, but would not be available to those outside of the African American community. So the language is still English, but you still have to translate it in one sense, right? So it's what we call intralingual translation. But at the end of the day, I'm really drawn to another important, not as famous as Benjamin or Derrida, but a really wonderful critic of translation, André Lefebvre, who coined this phrase about translation, who was very much interested in the practice of translation, right? So we've been talking about, we kind of began with the world, talked about practice, talked about philosophies of language and translation, and now I want to come back to the practice and sort of wind up my comments. So he has this phrase in this wonderful book that he wrote about how to actually translate, what you do when you sit down and you actually translate. So he translated from German. He was a professor when I got my PhD at the University of Texas. I never took classes with him, but I certainly was familiar with his work, André Lefebvre. And so he has this phrase called artist, where he says translators are artisans of compromise. Right? He says translators are artisans of compromise. And I love both those words in that very brief phrase, artisans. So an artisan is a potter, is a weaver, so not this high, grand idea, at the end of the day, you're doing something, it's something almost like something very practical. You're working with language. A potter might work with clay, but a translator is working with language, and you're an artisan, you are doing fairly, in some sense, mundane kind of work, but also compromise, right? So compromise, it's, if you're a purist and you're going to insist that every bit of this meaning should come over into this other place, translate, taking meaning from one place and putting it elsewhere, then you're not going to be a successful translator. So you're always making compromises. You're always choosing the best of 3 or 4 different solutions to a translation problem, none of which are in themselves perfect, right? So he has this idea of artisans of compromise, and I think it's a good phrase to return to as we think about all the different things that translation can and should do, because I'm sort of where Lefebvre is in my own attitude to translation. I want to acknowledge all its complexity. I want to acknowledge all the difficulties, right? So for a language skeptic like Derrida, I think the idea of, translation ever succeeding is completely impossible. Of course, for him, that becomes an ethical invitation, right? So I don't want to leave that neglected, that for him, that becomes an opportunity to think much more ethically about what we do when we use language. But I'm also with Lefebvre, I'm more with Lefebvre because the world does continue in translation, right? And I would go so far as to say that India, to bring it back home in a way, India is a nation in translation because it wouldn't exist as a nation without millions and multiple acts of translation from the most bureaucratic, from circulars from the government, which are both in Hindi and English, to business practices, to traveling to some city where you don't know the language, maybe Kolkata, and you don't know Bangla, and you're trying to find directions, and you try speaking Hindi, and the person doesn't understand you, and somebody stops and translates for you, right? So India as a nation is a nation in translation, right? And all that means is something that is worth engaging very powerfully. But the world is also the world in translation. And this is the reason why we should take it seriously. Even as we, recognize all the complexities which are involved. I'll end with a question that I want to pose to all of you, and maybe you'll help me think this through, because I can see that there are so many of you, and you might have the answer to this question. If you look at the Western tradition of translation, if you look at the Western tradition of translation, there is a very powerful scene of translation to which the philosophers and the commentators come back to repeatedly, right? And that is the Old Testament, the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, right? Where this group of people set out to build a tower which they can use to climb to heaven, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with this story from the Old Testament. And then God, who doesn't want to allow this to happen, destroys the tower, but in the very act of destroying the tower, scatters the people and makes them speak hundreds of different languages. So he doesn't want the tower ever to be built again. He destroys the tower. And the God of the Old Testament is a very jealous God, right? So he doesn't want his heaven to be breached. And so he destroys the tower, and then he also scatters the people and makes sure that they speak hundreds of different languages so they can never communicate with each other, and then begin to build a tower like this again. And it seems that God succeeded, because clearly no such tower has been built, right? So this is, of course, a very iconic scene of translation and languages, and Benjamin talks about it. Derrida talks about it extensively. He's fascinated by this story, and this is one of those, I would say, sort of foundational scenes of translation for the Western philosophical tradition. Is there such a scene for us in India? And I've been sort of thinking about this, and to tell you the truth, I haven't found one. And in all the different mythologies which make up India, whether they're Hindu mythologies or Muslim mythologies or Christian or whatever might be the case, all the different sort of stories and legends and myths and that make up, there are stories about language, but are there stories about translation? Are there stories about languages in the plural, which is where such stories would come out? What would be an Indian kind of mythic scene of translation, whether for better or for worse, because the Tower of Babel, is complicated. You don't just read it and see it as this wonderful affirmation of translation. Quite the contrary. So I'm not thinking in those terms. I'm just thinking about, is there any sort of myth of translation which has the same status as the Tower of Babel within an Indian context? And I would love to, I'm sort of crowdsourcing this question, right? So since I haven't been able to, there are many, to be clear, there are many stories about language, including the origin story of the Ramayana, right? How Valmiki comes to write the Ramayana, how he sees the two birds. So there are many wonderful stories about language, the power of language, the power of the word. I'm speaking specifically about translation and the differences between languages and whether there's any such word. So anyway, let me stop here. I've given you many ideas I hope to think about. I hope I've made sense. I hope I've shared something which is interesting and maybe also given us a question. I'm going to stop here now, and Rimika is going to tell us what happens next.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you very much for this absolutely fluent delivery and bombarding us with so much, by way of both takeaway and also to engage you further in conversation. Of course, I'll keep my comments towards the end because I don't want to eat into the participants' share of their time with you. So we do have one comment in the chat box, although I'd really encourage participants to, unmute and turn on their videos and maybe engage with you as directly virtually possible as can be. But at the moment, we do have a comment from Professor M. Sridhar. I think he's in Hyderabad as we speak. And he says, fascinating talk on the practice as well as the philosophy of translation. Thank you, Professor Shankar. I'm a practicing translator too, from Telugu to English. And I would like to ask if you would consider multiple translations of the same text as examples of interlingual translation. So that's Professor Sridhar.
Fascinating question. Thank you, Professor Sridhar, for that question. Which I haven't thought about before. So you're putting me on the spot in a really fine way. And so my first answer is to say, it might actually be I think you mean, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about when there's maybe a text in Telugu and it's translated by more than one person into English, yeah? If that is the case, then I would say, of course, it's interlingual translation, but it might also take us to interesting questions about intralingual translation, because how one particular translator solves the translation problem for themselves in going into English will be quite different from the way in which other people have solved it. And so we might actually be able to think about translation happening, take the insights that Jakobsen has about intralingual translation, right? Translation within the same language, and sort of use that. I will say that, and of course, I don't know enough. I certainly don't know Urdu in a way in which I could do it myself, but I am familiar with, familiar in the sense of trying to read and make sense, of the different translations of Faz into English by at least 3 or 4 different translators, right? And sometimes the same puzzles are translated by different, and then it's really interesting to see, what kind of choices, the translators make. And I think, it tells us something about, I hope I'm answering your question, Professor Sridhar. It tells us something about, I think, the different resources which are available within English or the target language, to use a phrase which I don't much like. So it's so militaristic, right? So, but translation theorists will often talk about source language and target language, but target language being the language into which you translate. So there's interesting questions here about, about the translation choices which are available in the target language, which may have something to do with intralingual translation.
Right, so I think one good turn deserves another. We have another, looks like a fantastic question again from Professor Gurupdesh Singh. I think he's logged in from Amritsar. And he says, as you say, translation can be understood in terms of movement in space or time or language transformation. I would like to know how all of this affects the process of actual translation. My curiosity is particularly to know how theoretical concepts of space and time are incorporated in the act of translation.
Again, a really, wonderful question. I myself, ever since I've started doing this exercise of having my students and doing this exercise myself also of translating translation, so to speak, I've been drawn to how much more complex and how much more interesting the etymologies of these other words for translation are. Than the etymology of translate in English, which seems to me, so in Tamil, language Mori is part of both the two words for translation, but one is language transformation. If I were to translate the Tamil word, it would be changing language, or changing, transforming language. And the other one would be making language, Moriyakum, making language. So there are sort of differences there, and both these words are in some use with regard to translation. I think the temporality of translation, which Hindi captures, with this sense of performance, speaking after, is something that we should pay a lot of attention to, because it is true that translations are displaced in time, typically, right? How much they're displaced in space is harder for me to grasp, but they are displaced in time, that, some passage of time happens. And even in that scene in the General Assembly of United Nations that I shared with you, there is at least a few moments of lag between the first speech and a really good interpreter. They're highly trained, of course, are kind of translating in real time, but even so, there's a little bit of lag. And I think that speaking after, captures some aspect of that. And I think we haven't attended to that. I think we've been very wedded to that Western philosophical tradition of thinking about translation, which derives from the etymology of translation, that I think we might do. So the thing about translation, which I want to really emphasize, is the performance aspect of it, right? And in that General Assembly scene, the performance is visible to us, right? I mean, it's or audible, it's obvious, it is happening right there. But I think there's a performance aspect to even the other classic scene of translation, which is somebody sitting with a book, and painstakingly translating, Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice into, Marathi or Tamil or some other language, very private scene over an extended period of time. But there's still a kind of a performance aspect of it, which we may want to think about. So I don't know if I've done justice to a really wonderful question, which really deserves a talk of its, own. So how theoretical concepts of space and time are incorporated in the act of translation. So I think with regard to time, I would say we need to think of the belatedness, the belatedness of the translation. I don't mean belatedness in a bad way, right? But that the passage of time, it's what it means to speak after, as the Hindi translation indicates. With regard to space, I think what we might want to think about is actually what I've been very interested in my early work on translation is institutional spaces, right? So one of the mistakes we make when we think about translation is to think of translation as the same across the sort of, it's the same, but it's very different whether translation is happening in a literary publishing house, or if it's happening in the street, or if it's happening in a bureaucratic office, So I think to take space as meaning really institutions might be a way to kind of give some concreteness to that etymological insight, which is there in in the English will translate.
Thank you for your response, sir. We have another one from Dr. K.K. Gautam. I think he's right here in Jaipur, or could be anywhere else. He says, I would like your comment on the term transcreation and how is it different from transformation?
Yeah, so transcreation is, as I understand it, a term which mostly is used to indicate a looser process of adaptation, right? So what I didn't really touch on, because of course there is, I hope it's clear to everybody that this is just kind of, you know, dipping your toe in the ocean of translation, so to speak. There is this, you know, transcreation is when one takes a text and then performs a much more loose, you know, translation and flags it for the reader and indicates to the reader by saying transcreation that, you know, because one of the sort of themes of translation and translation studies, which I have been very critical of, which I did not mention today, is this idea of fidelity, right? That you have to be faithful to an original, right? So for the longest time, there was this tradition, which again is very Western and has links to this idea of authorship and ownership of a text, right? And being true and authentic to somebody's, you know, speech act, right? So there's this whole, you know, theory of fidelity, which has really only been dethroned from its place of primacy in translation studies, I would say in the last 30 or 40 years, right? So I myself, you know, like Jakobson, like Derrida, like Benjamin, in different ways, very different theorists, but like them, I believe that an act of translation is an act of interpretation. So what do I mean? That actually we want to think about the ways that translation, like if I were to take a Toni Morrison novel and write an essay on it, Toni Morrison's novel is in English, and I'm writing an essay on it, on Beloved, let's say, because there are not enough essays on Beloved, you know, just joking. Of course, there are like thousands of essays on Beloved, but for some reason I've chosen to write another essay on Beloved, and this is an act of interpretation. I want to say that translating Beloved into Tamil is also an act of interpretation. You know, we think of it as a transference of meaning. We don't think of it as an interpretation, but we should think of it as interpretation. This is what Benjamin is saying. This is what Derrida is saying. This is what Jakobson is saying. Because you're making choices and you are, you know, interpreting the text as you go along, and we really want to foreground that, you know, and the consequences of this are very crucial, very important, because it allows us to get away from the question of fidelity, you know, whether my translation is faithful. It doesn't mean anything goes, because I still have to persuade the reader that my translation of Beloved is adequate, is justified, but it's not whether it's faithful, right? Whether it's an exact copy, right? It's an exact copy of Beloved, because it never can be. All it can be is the kind of an interpretation in Tamil of this novel in English, a different kind of interpretation than writing a critical essay, but still an interpretation. Yeah. So that's the transcreation, right? So transcreation is kind of is a term that is often used when somebody says, you know, I am like the film version of Macbeth. I think, was it called Macbeth? I think, you know, it's a transcreation, right? I mean, you could call it a transcreation because you have Shakespeare's play, and then you have this much more free form, you know, adaptation of that. I think I got detoured into the interpretation, because I would say transcreation is a form of translative act which acknowledges its own interpretive status very directly, but I think all translation is interpretation anyway.
Right, sir. Thank you. I think we'll now go to Dr. Neetham Mathur, whose hand has been raised for quite some time. My apologies, Dr. Mathur, but please fire away. It'll be lovely if you can also turn on your camera, so it's almost real.
Dr. Shankar. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you, Tamika?
Not at all.
Okay.
No, I just said that the video will be great and you have done just that.
Yeah.
Please carry on.
So my question, Dr. Shankar, is that when you are translating, say, from an Indian regional language into English, is the translator able to capture the nuances of the language, of the culture, of the people, of what they want to express, etc.?
I would say yes and no. So back to Andre Lefebvre's comment, artisans of compromise, and maybe I think you might be one critic that you're not familiar with. So let me just, I don't know how many of you are familiar with his work. So let me just put his name in the chat. And the phrase that I've been referring to is, yeah. So artisans of compromise, right? So and that's the reason why I love that phrase, because what that one would have to answer yes and no. Another really wonderful commentator on translation, of course, is A.K. Ramanujan, who translated extensively himself and was a poet. And he has in one of his essays this, he refers to some story where, translation is like the emperor who wanted to bring a bird back and then realized that you couldn't bring it from a foreign land, but realized that you couldn't bring the bird without bringing the nest, and then you couldn't bring the nest without bringing the branch on which the nest rested, and then you couldn't bring the nest without bringing the tree, and you couldn't bring the tree without bringing the whole place, right? So that to get the bird in its proper environment, you have, it's never ending. And he says translation is like that, right? So you switch, you then move from a kind of a literary translation to cultural translation, right? So what's the line that divides between, literary translation and cultural translation, right? Like, can you translate something, as you're saying, as the questioner is asking, can you translate a detail without actually translating the culture behind it? And I can give you a very, and I've written about this, so it's a good illustration. I can give you an example from my own practice as translator. When I was translating Tanni Tanir, there is this phrase which appears towards the end of the play, which is Vakarisi. Vakarisi is rice in the mouth, right? And it is a phrase, which is used there about these poor peasants are about to go off and confront the police. They might die, they might be lathi charged, all kinds of things could happen. And one of them, who's the leader, says to the others, consider yourself to have put, vakarsi in your mouth, and let's go for this confrontation. Vakarsi, of course, what you put in the mouth of the body when it's dead before cremation. And so consider yourself dead, right? So consider that your death has already come, so that's how brave you need to be. How do you translate it, right? How do you translate it? Because do you say rice in the mouth? Do you say, how exactly? That's a perfect illustration. And think of this problem. There's a very powerful phrase with all these resonances in Tamil, but not available to most English language speakers. I don't know how many non-Tamil speakers. I don't know how common this phrase is in other languages. So maybe other non-Tamil speakers may not be familiar with it either. What do you do with it? I think it is necessary to acknowledge that problem, right? To directly and unambiguously acknowledge that problem, but also realize that there are solutions that are available. Solutions like footnotes and glossaries and critical introductions, right? So one of the things that I've insisted on in my work is that we think about a culture of translation, by which I mean that we make, through talks like this and through the conversation we're having, generate this extremely rich understanding of translation that all of us, collectively begin to change the way in which we think about translation. And we begin to realize that everything doesn't have to happen in a single translative act, right? So everything doesn't have to be solved in a single translative act. There could be multiple solutions, right? Through multiple acts of translation. And there are multiple ways in which to translate. Some of them are good for one context, and others are good for another context, right? So you might want to do a highly scholarly translation of Tani with lots of footnotes for a scholarly audience, but you also want to convey the power of the play as a performed. The play has been performed in English translation, as I mentioned. So then, of course, you want to translate in a different way. And this is what thinking about translation as interpretation does, right? It allows you to the room to say, this translation is okay for this particular occasion and space, and this other kind of translation is okay for this other occasion. So that's what I would say. Yeah, I mean, there is always a problem, vak heresy, how do I translate it? But I can footnote it. I can have a glossary. I can have a critical introduction. I could have a longish essay at the back. I could have a note in the beginning and say, please, some of the cultural references are discussed. So there are a number of different solutions which are available to us.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks, sir, for these, I think, very extended responses. So sometimes, you have a talk and then you have another talk, which is probably, better than the one that you initiate the conversation with. But let me at this point go back to the chat box, and we do have Dr. Preeti Bhatt's message, which I will just read out for you. And she says, thank you very much for the very interesting and informative lecture on the dynamics of translation, Professor Shankar. I feel that translation can be a political act too, keeping in view the nuances of language and how subtly meaning changes with a minor change in words. What is your opinion regarding this aspect of translation?
It is absolutely a political act. I think, without a doubt, the only question is what politics, whose politics, in the direction of what politics. And this is what the culture of translation idea is supposed to do, because I'm interested in a world, I'm interested in thinking about the world which acknowledges the plurality of the world, right? Acknowledges both the commonality and the difference. And I think philosophies have struggled from either the one end or the other, right? So either to be so tempted by difference and to sort of exalt it, which takes us to a bind of not being able to see what it is that we're supposed to communicate with each other. Or the other end, so insist on commonality that that insistence becomes an imposition on other people, right? So these are not easy solutions, but I think what we need to do is translation is in fact one of the most powerful and illustrative and instructive areas where you can see these things getting played out. So I would say absolutely political, but political for me anyway, to think of it in a way in which doesn't allow the homogenization of the world, doesn't allow us to ignore the plurality and the diversity of the world, doesn't allow us to wrestle with difference, not necessarily make them go away, but wrestle with difference and also with commonality. They take neither for granted, right? I think, and translation really, because translation really depends on difference. I mean, one way to think about translation is to, and I've sort of written about this in a recent essay, which my original conception for this presentation today was to maybe read out sections of that essay. And then I decided that I think this free form conversation might work better. But what I say in that essay is, of course, that, translation begins from the invitation of difference, right? Because you recognize a difference. Baudelaire's poems in French, the language is different than German, and that becomes an invitation to Benjamin to translate. But from that invitation, which begins in difference, is the search for commonality, right? And that commonality, that search for commonality, you could think of as a bridge, right? Between, and I think it's that dwelling on the bridge. It's that ability to recognize both the difference and the commonality and the call of both that I think is, for me, important. And then there are political, I think it is a political position. Yeah.
Absolutely, sir. Couldn't agree more. I think at this point, I would just like to read out a message from one of our ex-students. But Anumika, would you want to read this out yourself, considering you're very much here, part of it, and your video is adequately turned on as well? Anumika Bahukandi, would you want to read out what you wrote for Professor Shankar? Of course, if you can't unmute for some reason, I'll come in. But are you around? She was, but anyway, I think I'll read it out for her. Well-articulated information on translation and significance got introduced to many new aspects of the term, a very informative session. So I think some nice words there. I think Dr. Prachi Goswami also says something about taking away a lot from this session. There's something else in the chat box while we wait for another raised hand. That's Dr. Anshu. She says, thank you for a very interesting exposition on translation and its various implications. Recently, of course, Red Samadhi was translated into English and it bagged the booker. Who do you think gets credit for the same, the writer or the translator?
A really good question again. There is, of course, a long tradition of making the translator invisible. And even to the extent, and I can remember books from my boyhood, translations of Russian novels, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and people like that, where the name of the translator would not be on the cover, may not even be on the fly page inside, might be on the copyright page, but really hidden away. Yeah. So there is a kind of a long and quite problematic, history of making the translator as invisible as possible. And that, I think, comes out of this idea of authenticity and fidelity, right? So the original, and this is what I mean by the culture of translation. I think the problem is both at the production end and at the reception end. The problem is at the production end because the publishers and the translator is like, okay, I need to be as faithful. I'm like a glass window through which meaning flows, but I myself must be as invisible as the glass itself is, right? So the light of Dostoevsky flows through that glass window and comes to the other side, but I, as translator, should not be visible. But the problem is also at the reception end, where readers want that, right? They don't want to acknowledge the place of the translator, because I don't know Russian, but I want to read Dostoevsky as if I knew Russian, right? Well, too bad. If you want to read Dostoevsky as if, in the Russian, then learn Russian, which is, of course, some of my colleagues in the Hawaiian language community are saying, right? So this is what I mean by the culture of translation. I think once we keep insisting and enriching contemporary understandings of translation in this culture of translation kind of a way, then maybe readers shouldn't ask for it, right? Shouldn't ask for that kind of translation. They should read a translation of Dostoevsky, hoping that an interpretation of Dostoevsky, which is rich and useful and meaningful, is given to them, but with the full knowledge that it's not the same as reading Dostoevsky in English, right? In Russian. So I think, who should get credit? I would say both, right? I should say both. I would say both should get credit. And I don't want to get into the game of like proportionality, to what extent the author and what extent the translator. I mean, obviously the author is being celebrated for this work. I hope the translator's work is also being, celebrated. And I've experienced this on both sides, but I've been a translator, but I'm also a novelist, and my novels have been translated into Spanish and Italian, and with neither of which languages I read. And I'm certainly happy to have been translated, and grateful for the translators for their work, right? So yeah, I think we definitely need to sort of acknowledge more fully the work of translation. And in some cases, of course, the translators have been everything, right? I mean, the translators have been absolutely crucial to the success of a translation. We haven't talked about this, the paired sort of translations, but there are some pretty famous examples, especially in poetry, of collaborations between a famous poet and somebody else. And I think some of the Urdu poetry has been translated in this way, where some famous American poets have collaborated. They don't know Urdu themselves, but they collaborate with somebody else who knows Urdu and make a translation. And here, of course, along with everything else, the fame of the poet, the American poet, I think W.S. Marvin has done this, and other names slip my mind, but many famous contemporary American poets, modern American poets have done this. And so, there is that phenomenon. It's also which also I have mixed feelings about, but certainly, yeah.
Right, sir. I think at this point, I'll get another ex-student of Professor Jain's. There's a special relationship. She's not just an ex-student. She was under his guardianship while she was a boarder, a resident student with us during her master's years. So Professor Jain was her local guardian, in fact, more family than family. And I think she has this very, very special bond, and I'm sure, in fact, she's probably the first person I think of when I'm planning the next year's memorial lecture. So Shefali Martins, bring it on. Come on in. Shefali, yes, we can hear you now, Shefali. Yes.
Namaskar, sir. Namaskar, ma'am. Very good afternoon to everybody over here. Sir, firstly, on behalf of Dr. Jain's family, I'd like to thank you for this beautiful, amazing, in detail not just translation in the literary context, but translation in the way we know it. We probably use translation every other day in our interactions. And like you mentioned to us, like Anuvad has a different context when we talk about Hindi. And when it is Hawaiian, translation means something else. So the beauty of today's lecture, other than the zillion references that you're sort of leaving us with, and the zillion context, is also how translation needs to be translated in context, and how people like you have done a beautiful, beautiful job of it. So, I mean, usually we often say things are lost in translation. Today, I'd like to say we've found a lot in translation. And what you said about India being a nation in translation is sort of going to be with us as this philosophy that you shared of a professor, that translators are artisans of compromise. So thank you so much, sir. And it's indeed a privilege to have you at this lecture. And I'd like to especially put in my thanks from the family as well as from a student of IIS University, who, by the way, also translates for profession. So thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shefali, for that comment. And I'm very honored to have been invited to give this presentation, and do want to acknowledge again, as I did at the beginning, the family. And these are important, I think, conversations that we need to have. And I'm pleased that some of what I said resonated with you, because how could anybody ask for more than that? So thank you.
Thanks so much, sir. I don't know. I can't see if we have any more raised hands. I don't think so. Nothing in the chat box either. So I'll just quickly come in at this point, sir. I mean, using the moderator compare prerogative. So I was wondering that, how we can also not think about translation, translating, and publishing alongside, you see, I mean, because we're looking at the history of translating, which is, I mean, of course, into English, which goes so far back as also the history of Indian English publishing. In fact, one must take due note of the fact that the recent developments in the publishing industry have also considered the impact of, translated books, literary books that have been translated, and the kind of, the manner in which they have influenced and shaped world opinion. And this is thanks to the translators, who now serve as curators. They're sort of eager to showcase the here and now of languages. I think that's what a translator / curator, transcreator, does in terms of, how they look at the here and now. And hopefully, eventually, this is going to even out. I mean, the practice of a translation backed by the philosophical underpinnings that you've mentioned, I hope that will even out the hierarchies of languages and regions. And even in the classics in translation publishing microcosm, that genre, it's actually very reassuring to see that the spotlight is now, moving over to the lesser represented languages, genres, and therefore regions. So I think, and of course with the Booker, one needn't say more, although I still feel a little uncomfortable that we need or continue to need Western validation to like our works more and better. But anyway, I mean, a Booker win is a great win all the same. So yeah, those were my very sort of random
Well,
thoughts.
absolutely, yeah. Thank you for those comments. Again, they're spot on. I mean, the only thing which I'll add is, of course, there is the phenomenon in India, which I'm familiar with as having been a student. I did my BA and my MA in Chennai before moving for graduate work to the US. So I was familiar with it back then, long time ago, but I think it remains to be the case now, which is the Indian literature and English translation. We talk about Indian writing in English, IWE, but there is also ILET, Indian literature and English translation, which is of course reading Mahashrita Devi in an English medium college in Chennai in English. So you're accessing the Bangla work through English. And I think this is again a very graphic illustration of the fact that India is a nation in translation. But so that a national canon of many languages is being constructed through this medium of ILET, Indian literature and English translation. But I think the ins and outs of this phenomenon are not sufficiently studied. So I would say, one invitation to this very excellent audience would be to maybe think about actually understanding, theorizing, studying, maybe sociologically studying as well, that phenomenon by which colleges are creating these canons of Indian literature, but it's really Indian literature and English translation, right? So, and I'm not against it or anything. I mean, I think maybe it's inevitable, but I think we do need to understand it.
True, sir, absolutely. I bring in Dr. Anita Kothari at this point. Again, she shared a very sweet relationship with sir in terms of being, if I remember correctly, ma'am, one of his very bright research scholars back in the day. So she says, thank you, Professor Shankar. It would be interesting here to also remember Tagore, who you, of course, just, you mentioned Mahashrita Devi, but she talks about Tagore, who wrote in Bangla and also translated his work himself. So I think there also that dynamic plays out maybe differently or in the same fashion as another person on a collaborative, sort of a creative exercise. So I think this is just a comment. Thank you, ma'am, for that. I think there is, I hope I'm not missing out on anyone. Yes, of course, there's Dr. Cheena Puri who writes to say thank you. Oh, okay, she's thanking me for giving the opportunity to them. Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Puri, that's most kind. I'm just hoping I'm not missing out on new comments. There's Professor Rupendra Guha Majumdar writing in again, well, how graciously thanking me, but then he's sorry that he couldn't join in on time. But no, sir, I think you're here and you're very much in time, because like I said, the media part is the latter half, when you're sort of, trying to engage with the speaker on all that was sort of thrown open. Dr. Cheena Puri also has her hand raised, so maybe she would want to now engage with you directly. Yes, Dr. Puri, please go ahead. We'll unmute Dr. Cheena Puri.
Yes. So I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Remika, because reminding me again and again to attend this. I never thought it would be so enlightening for me. Thank you so much, Professor Shankar, for raising different aspects of the complex process of translation. And coincidentally, I was asked by a Sanskrit poet to translate his haikus from Sanskrit, then to Hindi, and then in English. So I thought it would be an easy task, and I said yes. So when I was in the middle of the process, I wondered, what have I taken this project? Because, as a translator, I never thought that it would be difficult, to bring out the emotion or the feeling which the writer feels. I had the opportunity to meet the person and discuss with him that did he mean this exactly? So though they were just 3 or 4 lines haiku and they are about 168, but I am stuck in between. And this discourse made me realize that it's with so many different, areas to be understood. It's just not translating from one language to the other. It involves so many other, the emotional aspect also, what the writer is feeling. Are we able to capture that or not? So I think this discourse has come at a very important moment for me personally. And Rimika, thank you so much. Please do connect again whenever. I would like to read some of the books if there are of Professor Shankar on the process of translation and how he has done this. Thank you so much, Professor Shankar, for raising important issue.
Thanks,
Thank you
thanks,
for
Dr.
that.
Puri. Sorry, sir, please.
No, thank you for that comment. And just remember that you're engaging in an act of interpretation. So you don't have to get everything right, because that would be impossible anyway. And an author's own opinion is not necessarily to be trusted, right? So, because you might see something which they don't, but it's really like yours is going to be one act of interpretation alongside many others. Yeah.
So maybe talking to the writer on the first hand would give some inputs which otherwise would not be available if we don't have the writer, the person. So that I think makes some difference. We cannot have all the writers whom we are translating, but in this case, I do.
There's no harm in talking to the writer, but if you see something that the writer doesn't see, then can you see what the writer doesn't see? So,
so the reader's aspect is there. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Puri. It was indeed a pleasure to have you over. And yes, we do have a few of sir's books, and we'll be happy to share more information. We just like to show off the memorial speakers every year. So I leave no stone unturned in letting everyone know, everyone who I want to be a part of it, who I know will benefit immensely from the kind of scholarship, we like to have and be proud of. Yeah, thanks again. We do have a new comment in the chat box. It's from Rimisha. She says, I'm interested in teaching English to speakers of other languages. So I would like to know, how does translation affect teaching and learning, the process of teaching learning?
I think, well, I mean, you are in a scene of translation, though what is interesting about language teaching, which I don't know myself, I've learned languages, including German, and there is, and I mentioned German because when I learned German as an adult, well, I had studied it as a child as well. The class that I took was immersion, and so the idea was that we're not going to, everything is going to be in German from the beginning. So I think there is a strong tradition of language teaching, which is maybe antithetical to translation, in the sense that you just throw them into the language and you have an immersive environment, and then that's the best way to learn the language. But nevertheless, even if that is, and I don't know because I'm not a teacher of languages, but even if that is the preferred method, best practices for teaching language, I still think you are in a scene of translation. Translation is still happening in that classroom, even if the teaching methodology doesn't acknowledge it directly, right? And it's trying to get the students to not translate, because as many of you might know, you are supposed to know a language when you no longer are translating from one language into the other, but are thinking or are able to formulate, in that language. So I think it's a complicated situation where I think translation is present, even if what we narrowly call translation is not supposed to be part of the teaching methodology.
Right, sir. Ramisha, I hope you got your response. I will now go across to Dr. Saeed Haider, who's raised his hand and I think has joined us all the way from somewhere in the UK. Hi, Saeed. Shoot.
Hello, good morning. Well, it's good morning here in London. It's quite early and I'm driving to work and listening to a really engaging and interesting conversation. Apologies for the delay in joining the conversation. So I did miss the talk, but I have found the exchange and the Q&A really, really engaging. Please do forgive me if my question is slightly off topic, but I'm interested in your thoughts when it comes to issues of fidelity within sort of, say, a religious context. How parallel is the literary translation, the world of literary translation, and the translation work that happens, say, within a religious context? So whether it's the translation of the Quran, for example, how much are translators aware of the reading public and therefore the need for fidelity in that sort of adjacent context?
Excellent question. And there is a fair amount of scholarship on this. There have been, especially when it comes to Bible translations, there have been quite a few, theorists of translation who have either studied translations of the Bible or came out of backgrounds of translating the Bible. And because, as you can imagine, in an evangelical religious tradition like Christianity, then translation is absolutely crucial, because you are, you're taking this sacred text and you are going to Latin America and you want to, in fact, I'll stay with the Hawaii example, which I know really well. In fact, the Hawaiian script was created, and literacy in Hawaii went to almost 100% literacy within about 15 or 20 years, mainly because of the activity of Christian missionaries in the early 19th century, who came from New England and set about Christianizing essentially, this group of people who were not Christians, obviously. So I think, so there is actually a fair amount of, scholarship on this. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the name of Eugene Nida, but Eugene Nida is one of the most influential, writers on translation. And his background, unlike people like Benjamin and André Lefebvre and Derrida, is not as a philosopher. He was a Christian. He was part of an organization which was about translating the Bible into different languages. He ran workshops for translators of the Bible, was very active over about 20, 30 or 40 years. And and over a period of time, he developed this theory of translation, which and this standard text to read in a translation studies class, where he talked about dynamic equivalence, right? So he was struggling with this same idea of like, how do you translate the Bible in a way which is both true to the word of God, which is what the Bible is, but at the same time, make it relevant to the people for whom you're translating. And he came up with this theory of dynamic equivalence. So I'm not religious myself. I'm an atheist, and so I don't myself confront these problems when I translate. For me, since I am an atheist, a sacred book is a book like many others. But I do recognize that for a community of believers, it is different, and that, of course, is something that any ethical, principled translators should engage. I think the problem is, of course, what you do with, which is what Nida was really struggling with. I don't think he quite answered it in his own scholarship, though he came up with a number of different practical solutions to it. Is that how do you take what is the definitive word? Because translation would seem to imply that word, what does it mean when you say that word can be translated? Is that is that a reduction of the status of this scriptural text, or Or on the other hand, if you want to expand the community of Christians, then you do want to translate, right? So you do want to translate. You want to spread and that's the paradox which I think he is, confronting there, and which I think is there with the translation of the sacred book. So your question is really excellent. It's not a problem that I face personally in my own sort of thinking about translation for the reason that I mentioned, but I do think it is an issue in the world, right? It is one which is something which is, and so with regard to the, with the Quran, that of course, in parts of the world where the Quran is still, recited in the original Arabic, in mosques, and that is the preferred way, and because of course you can't really translate the scriptural text. I don't know if I'm actually getting at anything that you're interested in.
I don't know, he may have got cut off, but
it was an excellent question though. Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, he did say that it's going to be early in the day. I think it's just about 8:15 a.m. there, but it's still not that early. So I said, no, try your best to come in, and he did. So thank you, Syed, if you're still listening, but you've got disconnected, then, I'll give you the gist of it. I'm sure he heard most of it. In the meantime, I think one of my colleagues can't access her video, but I'll be happy to read out her comment. Ms. Smita Sharma, who is in the department with me, says, thank you, Professor Shankar, for your enlightening talk on translation and its nuances. It's very helpful as an academician to learn about the various aspects related to translation and share them with the students. So thank you once again. Thanks, Smita. Thanks for being around. And I guess now I should go to Dr. K.K. Gautam again, because he has been, pretty at it as he has raised his hand. Though I tried not to look at it once, but then his persistence. So Gautam, sir, yes, please go ahead. Maybe some response to your answer to his earlier comment. Yes, sir.
Okay. Hello. Well, thank you very much, Professor Shankar. I think you have uncomplicated many of the notions related to the activity of translation. So I would like to make 3 points actually, and I would like your observations and responses to them. One, for me, because I've been trying to translate some of the well-known English poems, like Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, or When You Are Old by W.B. Yeats. And my experience says, that this activity becomes only a kind of pretext, for me to move into terrain of my own personal biases and personal understandings and interpretations of the text. This is one. Two, how would you like to respond to using translation as a viable pedagogy for teaching English to the students of other languages? Number three, when I was trying to translate one of the short plays by Harold Pinter, I encountered a lot of problems actually, because he makes wonderful use of silences and pauses. So how does one go about translating silences and pauses? Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to have your comment on that.
Wonderful questions. The second question I'm going to leave aside because I'm not a teacher of languages. So as I said earlier on, I think there is a school of thought that you actually don't translate in teaching languages, that you try to immerse the student in the language and allow them to pick it up, which is the way in which we learn languages in childhood, right? So, and that it's a more robust way to acquire a language. But, I'm speaking out of turn, it's not my area of expertise, so I won't say anything more than that. How do you translate silence? I think that is a really, I think that is an important, I think your third question and your first question are kind of linked. And so I will deal with them together. The thing about Emily Dickinson, of course, is that her formal innovation in her poetry, right, aside from everything else, is the typographical sort of innovations that she introduces, the lines, the line breaks, the use of punctuations, in sort of very idiosyncratic ways. So I think I should be clear, even though I didn't say this explicitly, I think it should be clear from my talk that translation doesn't stop at the word at the level of translating the meaning of a word, right? I mean, I hope it's, in fact, that's the least, well, I shouldn't say least, but it's just one aspect of translation, and it's certainly the most studied, and therefore the least interesting, because you're talking, you're understanding this, this way of understanding a text as a kind of a vessel which contains meaning, and then you're going to extract the meaning and put it over here. It is to actually not pay attention to formal aspects, which is what I think I want to do in responding to your questions, because I can't imagine trying to translate Emily Dickinson into Tamil or into Hindi without, in some sense, trying to capture her formal experimentation as well, right? So, and that may be easy to do in some cases, because of course, Tamil and Hindi, like in their modern kind of ways of writing it, have taken on board many of the, aspects of punctuation and typography in English. So it actually may not be that difficult to repeat some of her, sort of innovations in Hindi or in Tamil, because for a modern reader of Hindi or Tamil, they would have some of the same effects. On the other hand, there are formal aspects which are not that easy to translate, right? But should be understood as a challenge of translation, which is to say, so one school of translation, which I sometimes pursue at some moments, is to say that my job is not to bring something over in some kind of a faithful way, but rather to try and create an effect in Tamil or in Hindi, which a reader of English would experience in reading Dickinson, right? So it's slightly different than saying, I need to sort of repeat this as closely as possible, right? But what I want to do rather is to create a state of mind or to create an experience in reading something which the reader of English, the English reader of Dickinson might experience, So to think of formal elements as also requiring translation and also needing to be translated through sort of methods that are available to us, through methods of the artisans of compromise, right? Sort of, methods which are effective in some ways and not effective in other ways. I would say that's that is important. And I would say with regard to silence, it's the same thing. I mean, silence is often a kind of a formal or a semantic element. I mean, Harold Pinter, it's been a long while since I read him, but they are, silences in those texts are also used in extremely formal ways as well as semantic ways, right? The silence is not just absence of meaning, but also has a certain kind of a structural role to play in the text. And I think attempting to capture that is what one would do.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Shankar.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. And thank you, Dr. Gautam. I think you did a very good thing by coming in personally, because I just wouldn't have been able to read all of your comments from the chat box and do justice in one go. And then if you sort of break the flow, then the whole essence of a continuous delivery is also lost for the speaker to respond to. So thank you for hanging in there and giving me time to come back to you. I don't think we have any more queries or raised hands, although I would like to acknowledge one of our, again, former students, former scholars, appreciative comment, Dr. Ela. In fact, Ela, if you're right here, can you unmute and maybe turn on your camera and thank Professor Shankar yourself? Can you do that? I'll be happy to read out your comment, but I can see you. So, I mean, I can see you logged in. But I think she just had nice things to say about the kind of the way the sort of world has opened up in terms of new ways of seeing and knowing and engaging. I think that's the whole idea of the primary takeaway from such talks anyway. So I think that's also time. Yes, we do have someone who's unmuted her mic.
Namaskar, ma'am.
Ila, is that you? Because I really can't see you in that scroll. Yes, please go ahead and you can thank the professor yourself. Yes, please.
Namaskar, ma'am. I thank Shankar, sir. And as I said, it is really being a part of this academic circle. And I thank everyone for inviting me for this, because these interactive discourses are, are more than what we read. The information that we get from books or other sources available. I mean, it appears as if this adds to, we are practicing, I mean, what we are reading. And yes, when I talk to my students or my colleagues, these interactive sessions make me understand things more clearly and talk in a more understanding way to my students also and my colleagues, as I said. So we have so much to whatever in our syllabuses we study or we teach. We have so much translation studies and all these questions and answers that Sir has attended to, and uh, the respectable fraternity has raised up. I mean, the answers to these questions are much needed. So I thank Sir, and I cannot thank enough to the organizers and Sir. I thank again. Thank you, Sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you. Absolutely. I think we need these timely reminders of exactly what we are doing, both in the classroom and in the ways in which we approach the whole exercise, the business of scholarship, as it were. I guess, yeah, that's it, because we wouldn't like to keep you for way too long, however much we want to, sir. But I guess, we need to let you go. So as we come to the close of today's event, I thank late Professor Jain's family. In fact, his wife, I think, has been there throughout, Dr. Mrs. Mithilesh Jain, and his friends and students, in whose being here today, even though virtually, we draw the strength and motivation to keep doing our utmost for the highest. I'm also very grateful to our Honorable Chancellor in absentia, to Honorable Vice Chancellor, and to Madam's Registrar and the Dean for their support and encouragement throughout. My thanks go to my colleagues as well for ensuring that everything came together seamlessly today. Their concerted efforts have led to the smooth conduction of today's program. And of course, thank you all, each one of you, for joining in. My teachers, Jain sir's colleagues, friends, students, research scholars from, I think, back in the 50s and 60s. It's just so heartening to see that, we're still here and in it together. And Professor Shankar, I can't thank you enough. Like, everybody's been saying that, but we mean it. We would have loved to have you over to host you on, on campus and generally be with you and have you spend time with our students as well. But we do understand your prior commitments. But next time for sure, I think, because we do know you have this consistent India connection, so we're not letting you go off so easily. So hopefully next time in some other context, and we'll keep this up. Thank you all for joining in, and some of them have stuck around till the very end, despite many of them saying that they do have prior engagement. It's that time of the day also, so 11 to 1 is, I think, peak hours for most people.
Right.
But I think...
Well, let me just say my thank yous to everybody. Thank you to Rebecca and everybody else. Really enjoyed this interaction, and I love coming to Jaipur. So invite me again and have me come there in person, and we will do it. Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful. It'll be our pleasure, sir. Thank you all once again. I think we got our photographs as well, so a few snapshots to remember this day by. Thank you, everyone. Once again, take care, stay safe, and a happy Diwali to all of you, to you, sir, as well. And
Yes.
season's greetings. And
yes, happy Diwali to everybody.
Thank
Yes.
you, sir. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining in.